There's a quiet shift that happens when you sit down with an episode of All in the Family, and you realize that what looks like a debate on the surface isn't really about ideas anymore. It's about something closer, something more personal, something that has less to do with who is right and more to do with how people feel when they're being challenged. And there's one particular kind of episode that captures that feeling in a way that's almost uncomfortable in its honesty. The kind where what starts as a conversation about a social issue slowly transforms into something that feels like it's about the people in the room rather than the topic itself. The episode I keep thinking about unfolds in that familiar living room, the same space that feels both safe and suffocating at the same time. A place where conversations don't just happen, they linger, they echo, they settle into the walls in a way that makes every argument feel heavier than it might anywhere else. And it begins, like so many of the show's most memorable moments, with something that doesn't seem like it should matter that much. Archie is there, settled into his chair, already grounded in his sense of how things are supposed to be. And there's something about the way he occupies that space that makes everything he says feel more final than it actually is. Like he's not just offering an opinion, he's declaring something that shouldn't need to be questioned. Mike is nearby, and you can almost feel the tension before anything is even said, because his presence alone suggests that the conversation could turn, that any statement Archie makes might be examined, challenged, pulled apart in a way that Archie doesn't appreciate, even if he expects it. Gloria moves between them, trying to keep things light, trying to keep things from becoming too serious too quickly, and is there with that same gentle warmth, that same instinct to keep the peace, to remind everyone without saying it directly that this is a home, not a battlefield. The topic itself isn't explosive at first. It might be something about changing roles, about expectations, about how people are supposed to behave in relationships or in society, something that reflects the broader cultural shifts of the 1970s, but it's introduced casually, almost as a passing thought, something that could have stayed small if it had been left alone. But it is. Archie says something that carries his usual certainty, something that reflects his belief in a certain order, a certain way of doing things, and it's not framed as an argument. It's framed as common sense, as something that should be obvious to anyone paying attention. And Mike responds, not with anger, not with hostility, but with disagreement, quiet at first, measured, almost careful, as if he's aware that what he's saying could lead somewhere else, somewhere more intense. And for a moment, it still feels like a discussion, like something that could stay contained. But then something changes. Not in the volume of the voices, not in the words themselves, but in the way they're being heard. Because Archie doesn't just hear a different opinion, he hears a challenge, and not just a challenge to his ideas, but to his authority, to his sense of himself as someone who understands how the world works. And Mike, whether he realizes it or not, isn't just offering an alternative perspective. He's pushing against something that Archie holds onto very tightly, something that feels personal even if it's being discussed as a general idea. That's when the argument begins to shift. It stops being about the topic. It becomes about them. about how they see each other, about how they feel about being contradicted, about being dismissed, about being misunderstood. And that's where the show does something incredibly subtle but incredibly powerful. It lets that shift happen without announcing it, without turning it into a dramatic turning point. It just lets the conversation evolve naturally, almost quietly, until you realize that the energy in the room has completely changed. Gloria tries to intervene, tries to bring the conversation back to something manageable, something less personal, but her efforts are complicated by the fact that she's emotionally tied to both sides, and that makes her reactions feel less like mediation and more like participation, even when she's trying not to take a side. Steps in two, offering kindness, offering a softer perspective, trying to remind them in her own gentle way that this doesn't have to become something bigger, that they can still connect, still understand each other even if they don't agree. But the thing is, once the argument becomes personal, it's very hard to pull it back into something purely ideological. Because now, every word carries a different weight. Every response feels like it's not just about the idea being discussed, but about how the other person sees you, how they value your perspective, how they respond to your way of thinking. Archie's reactions become sharper, not necessarily louder, but more defensive, more rooted in something deeper than the topic at hand. And you can feel that what he's really responding to isn't just the disagreement. It's the feeling of being questioned in his own home, in his own space, by someone he already sees as challenging his worldview. Mike doesn't back down, but his responses change too. There's a moment where you can sense that he realizes this isn't just about the issue anymore, that it's become something more personal, and yet he continues, not because he wants to hurt Archie, but because he believes in what he's saying, because he feels that pulling back would mean conceding something important. And that's where the tension really settles in. Because now, no one is just arguing about an idea. They're arguing about themselves, about their place in the world, about how they see each other. The living room becomes more than just a setting at this point. It becomes a kind of emotional container, a space where everything feels amplified, where there's no escape from the conversation, no way to step outside of it and reset. And that's part of what made the show so groundbreaking, especially in the context of its time, because it wasn't afraid to let conversations play out in this way, to let them become messy, uncomfortable, unresolved, in a way that felt much closer to real life than anything else on television at the time. Most sitcoms would have found a way to wrap things up neatly, to resolve the conflict, to bring everyone back together in a clear and satisfying way. But here, the resolution is more ambiguous, more honest. The humor, too, shifts in this kind of episode. It's not about delivering jokes in a traditional sense. It's about the way the characters interact, the way Archie's certainty becomes almost ironic in the face of Mike's persistence, the way Gloria's frustration feels both relatable and quietly funny in its intensity, the ways attempts to soften the moment create brief pockets of relief that don't quite last. And there's something about that kind of humor that lingers, that doesn't just make you laugh and move on, but makes you think, makes you reflect, makes you recognize something about your own experiences in the way these characters behave. Because the truth is, we've all been in conversations like this. Conversations where the topic starts out as something external, something distant, something that feels safe to discuss. And then slowly, almost without noticing, it becomes personal. It becomes about how we feel, about how we're being heard, about what it means to be challenged by someone we care about. And once it reaches that point, it's very hard to separate the idea from the emotion. That's what this episode captures so well. That moment where you realize that you're no longer arguing about the issue. You're arguing about the relationship, about respect, about understanding, about whether the other person really sees you. And as the argument continues, there's a kind of emotional layering that builds, small reactions stacking on top of each other, small misunderstandings compounding, until the original topic feels almost irrelevant compared to the feelings that have been stirred up. There's no big explosion, no dramatic climax, just a steady, persistent tension that refuses to resolve itself neatly. And then, gradually, the energy begins to shift again. Not because the argument has been solved, but because it can't sustain itself at the same intensity forever. Voices soften, pauses grow longer. There are moments where it feels like someone might say something that could bring everything back together, something that could bridge the gap that has formed. Sometimes that moment comes close. Sometimes it doesn't quite happen. And that's what makes the ending feel so real. Because it doesn't offer a clear resolution. It doesn't tell you that everything is okay now. It just lets the conversation fade, lets the characters settle into a quieter space, where the tension hasn't completely disappeared, but has softened enough to allow for something else, something more reflective. And as a viewer, you're left with that feeling, that recognition, that understanding that what you just watched wasn't really about the issue they were discussing. It was about them, about how easily conversation can become confrontation, about how quickly disagreement can become personal, about how difficult it is to separate what we believe from who we are. And that's why this kind of episode stays with you. Not because of a specific moment or a memorable line, but because of the way it mirrors real life, the way it captures something that feels true in a way that's hard to articulate but easy to recognize. It's a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful conflicts aren't about ideas at all. They're about people and the spaces between them and the things they struggle to say, even when they're saying everything.